On the evening when Aldermere Hall glittered beneath a ceiling of endless chandeliers, the air itself seemed to tremble with expectation, as though every whisper of silk and every measured step upon the marble floor carried the weight of judgment. London's elite had gathered in their finest restraint, each smile carefully practiced, each glance sharpened into a quiet weapon. At the center of this world stood the Duke of Ravenshollow, a man whose name alone commanded silence in conversation and obedience in courtly rooms, yet whose eyes tonight carried a distant absence that no one dared name aloud. Beside him stood his Duchess, Lady Evelyn Ashbourne, composed in pearl satin and pale silver lace, a vision of grace that seemed almost too delicate for the cold architecture of aristocratic admiration that surrounded her. Evelyn had once believed that marriage to the Duke would feel like standing beside a roaring fire in winter, dangerous perhaps, but warm enough to soften even the harshest season. Instead, she had learned to interpret silence, to translate the smallest withdrawal of his gaze, the briefest hesitation before he offered her his arm. That evening, however, something had shifted in ways even practiced observers could not ignore. The Duke did not offer his arm immediately upon entering the hall. Instead, his attention lingered toward the far end of the ballroom, where a young widow in deep emerald silk was already surrounded by admiring nobles. The Duchess felt it before she understood it. A subtle repositioning, a quiet erasure that required no announcement. When the Duke finally moved, it was not toward her but toward Lady Seraphina Vale, the woman whose laughter had recently become a familiar note at every gathering where he appeared. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her fan, though her posture remained immaculate, as though dignity alone could substitute for recognition. Around them, society shifted its gaze with predatory curiosity, sensing the beginning of something unspoken but irreversible. "You are radiant this evening, Lady Seraphina," the Duke murmured, his voice carrying effortlessly across a cluster of listeners. It was not the words themselves that struck Evelyn, but the ease with which they were spoken, the absence of hesitation that once belonged only to her. She stood nearby, not ignored in visibility but in significance, a presence acknowledged yet emotionally displaced. A gentleman beside her whispered a remark he thought she could not hear, yet it reached her all the same. "It seems His Grace has chosen a different star to guide him tonight." Evelyn did not respond. She had long mastered the art of stillness, a skill refined not from weakness but from necessity. Yet beneath the composed exterior, something began to fracture quietly, like ice forming hairline cracks across a frozen lake. She remembered when the Duke once looked at her as though she were the only sound in a silent world. Those moments now felt like stories she had been told rather than lived. Across the room, the Duke laughed softly at something Lady Seraphina said, a sound Evelyn had not heard directed at her in weeks. The distance between husband and wife was not measured in steps but in recognition, and tonight that distance had become a public spectacle. The orchestra played on, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the shifting gravity within the room, as if music alone could preserve illusion. Evelyn turned slightly, her gaze falling upon her own reflection in a mirrored pillar. She saw not a neglected wife, but a woman still composed enough to be mistaken for untouched. Yet even mirrors could not preserve what society slowly eroded. Behind her reflection, she noticed two ladies exchanging a glance, followed by the briefest, cruelest smile of understanding, the kind that required no words to wound. When the Duke finally returned to her side much later in the evening, it was not with apology or explanation, but with the formality of duty. He offered his hand for the customary dance, yet his eyes once again drifted beyond her shoulder as though searching for a different partner entirely. Evelyn accepted his hand without protest. Her fingers were steady, but her silence had begun to change shape, no longer obedient but observant, no longer forgiving but recording. As they stepped onto the floor, the hall seemed to lean inward, waiting for confirmation of what it already suspected. The Duke's gaze briefly met hers, but only for a second too short to carry warmth, and in that fraction of time Evelyn understood something irreversible settling within her. She was no longer being forgotten. She was being replaced in real time, beneath crystal light and the careful applause of a society that always preferred spectacle over sorrow. If you like my content, don't forget to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments. And as the first notes of the waltz deepened around them, Lady Seraphina was invited to stand at the edge of the dance floor, watching with a smile that did not hide its certainty, while Evelyn realized with chilling clarity that tonight was not an ending but the beginning of her erasure. After the night of the waltz, London did not speak of the Duchess openly, yet she began to exist in conversation only through absence, a quiet omission that grew louder with each passing gathering. The Duke of Ravenshollow continued to attend society with the same commanding grace, but now always accompanied by Lady Seraphina Vale, whose presence seemed to bloom beside him like a flower placed too deliberately in the center of a painting. Where once the Duchess's arm had rested lightly upon his, there was now only calculated space, filled by rumor and careful observation. Evelyn Ashbourne remained within Ravenshollow House for days without complaint, though silence within those walls had begun to feel heavier than any spoken insult. The servants moved differently around her now, gentler yet more distant, as though unsure whether to acknowledge her as mistress or memory. Letters arrived from acquaintances once eager for her presence. Each invitation now softened into formality that expected refusal. She replied to none. The first gift arrived on a rainy afternoon, delivered in a velvet-lined box containing a necklace of pearls the color of muted dawn. No note accompanied it. Only the Duke's seal pressed into wax, precise and impersonal. Evelyn held the box for a long moment before closing it without wearing the gift. It was not the value that unsettled her, but the timing, the distance between gesture and meaning, as though affection could be administered like medicine after illness had already taken hold. At the Grand Whitmore soirée the shift became undeniable. The Duke entered with Lady Seraphina on his arm, and though custom demanded discretion, there was nothing discreet in the way he guided her through introductions, pausing longer for her opinions than he ever had for his wife's voice. Evelyn arrived later, alone, her presence announced not by companionship but by protocol. Conversations softened as she passed, like curtains drawn over windows to conceal light that no longer belonged. "You must forgive the change in arrangement," a countess whispered behind her fan, though there was no apology in her tone. "His Grace seems recently persuaded by different counsel." The words were not cruel, yet they carried the weight of certainty, the kind that required no confirmation. Evelyn merely inclined her head, a gesture so practiced it concealed everything except endurance. Inside, however, she began to notice something unfamiliar forming, not grief exactly, but clarity, sharp and unsettling, like waking too suddenly from a dream that had long dictated reality. She saw now how often she had been placed slightly behind him in rooms, how conversations paused when she entered but did not resume with her included. The Duke, meanwhile, moved through society with increasing ease, as though a burden had been lifted rather than a bond fractured. Lady Seraphina's laughter had become a familiar accompaniment to his public life, and with each appearance the distance between husband and wife ceased to be subtle. It became architecture. One evening, Evelyn received a letter not from her husband, but from Lady Seraphina herself. The handwriting was elegant, composed, and disturbingly considerate. It spoke of admiration, of shared understanding, of circumstances that time may clarify more gently than society allows. There was no accusation, yet every line felt like an assertion of placement, as though Evelyn's position had already been respectfully reconsidered. She did not tear the letter. She placed it within a drawer beside others of its kind, forming a quiet archive of displacement. The scandal did not erupt in a single moment, but rather settled into conversation like fog, undeniable yet unchallenged. Whispers no longer asked whether the Duke preferred Lady Seraphina. They discussed how long decorum would continue pretending otherwise. Evelyn's name was no longer spoken with curiosity but with caution, as though it might fracture under attention. And then came the evening when the Duke, at a royal reception beneath gilded ceilings and watchful portraits, publicly deferred to Lady Seraphina's judgment on matters once reserved for his wife's counsel. Evelyn stood only a few paces away, yet the distance felt absolute. In that moment, something within her shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the irreversible precision of a door closing without witness. That night, as carriages departed and chandeliers dimmed into softened gold, Evelyn returned to Ravenshollow House not as a woman wronged, but as one beginning to observe the shape of her own disappearance, and for the first time she did not ask when it had begun, but how far it had already gone before anyone noticed. A final unopened envelope waited upon her writing desk, bearing the Duke's seal once more, but this time the wax was broken slightly at the edge, as though even intention itself had begun to fracture before reaching her hands. She did not touch it immediately. Instead she studied it as though it might speak first, as though within the fractured wax there might be an explanation capable of undoing what silence had already decided. The servants outside her door hesitated but did not enter, as if the house itself had learned to respect her solitude more than her title. When at last she broke the seal, the paper within was not what she expected. It was brief, formal, yet unsettlingly unfinished, as though the Duke had begun writing and abandoned restraint halfway through intention. No apology followed, no clarity, only an invitation requesting her presence at a private audience the following evening, away from the eyes of society. The handwriting bore attention she had never seen in him before, a subtle disruption of control that made the message feel less like command and more like uncertainty attempting disguise. Evelyn folded the letter slowly, and for the first time since the beginning of her erasure, she felt not grief nor anger, but the faint, dangerous sensation that something within the Duke of Ravenshollow was beginning to fracture as well. Outside, rain returned softly against the glass, marking time that no longer belonged to her anymore. That evening, the sky over London had darkened into a low, pressing sheet of rain, as though the heavens themselves had lowered their gaze upon Ravenshollow House. Inside, every corridor seemed quieter than usual, not from peace but from anticipation that had no name. Evelyn Ashbourne stood beside the tall window of her private drawing-room, watching water trace fragile paths down the glass, each line disappearing before it could become memory. She had not been summoned, yet she knew the summons was inevitable, carried not by words but by the uneasy silence that had followed the Duke's fractured letter. When the knock finally came, it was restrained, almost hesitant, unlike the authority that usually ruled these halls. The Duke of Ravenshollow entered without the confidence that once defined his presence. His coat was damp at the edges, his gloves still in his hand, as though he had forgotten the ritual of composure. For a moment neither spoke, and in that silence the distance between them felt more exposed than any ballroom ever could reveal. "You requested my presence," Evelyn said at last, her voice steady, carefully measured, like a blade held in still air. The Duke hesitated, a gesture so uncharacteristic that it altered the atmosphere between them. "I did," he replied, then stopped as though the word itself had failed him. He moved a few steps into the room but did not sit, as if uncertain whether he had the right to occupy space that once felt unquestioned. Evelyn turned from the window, facing him fully for the first time in days. There was no tremor in her expression, only an attentive stillness that unsettled him more than accusation ever could. "Then speak, Your Grace," she said softly. "I have grown accustomed to endings that arrive without explanation. It would be novel to hear one formed in words." The Duke exhaled, slow and uneven. "There are no endings," he began, then corrected himself immediately as though even denial felt dishonest. "Not as you assume. Not as society assumes." His gaze shifted briefly toward the floor before returning to her, and in that fractured moment Evelyn saw something she had not expected: uncertainty, unguarded and unpolished. "You have stood beside me for years," he continued, voice tightening with restraint, "and yet I find myself unable to understand when that distance began." The admission was not elegant. It was raw, almost disoriented, as though he were describing a landscape that had shifted beneath his feet without permission. Evelyn listened without interruption. Her silence was not passive, it was deliberate, a space she allowed him to fill with truths he had long avoided naming. "I did not intend displacement," he said finally, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. "Yet I see now that intention is not required for consequence. Lady Seraphina did not take your place. I permitted confusion where certainty should have remained." At that, something subtle shifted in Evelyn's expression, not anger, not relief, but recognition. "Confusion," she repeated quietly as though testing the weight of it. "How convenient a word for absence." The Duke flinched, though not visibly. "It is not convenience," he replied. "It is failure." Rain pressed harder against the glass, as though urging the room toward resolution. Evelyn stepped forward then, closing the distance he had left untouched. "Do you know what is most extraordinary, Your Grace?" she asked. "It is not that I was replaced in your sight. It is that I remained long enough to observe it happening." His eyes lifted sharply at that, a flicker of something almost like pain crossing his controlled demeanor. "You speak as though I chose blindness," he said. "No," she answered gently, and the gentleness itself made the words sharper. "I speak as though you allowed sight to drift elsewhere until I became unnecessary to what you chose to see." The room fell into a silence that was no longer empty, but dense, charged with the weight of unspoken years. The Duke took a step closer, then stopped again, as though even proximity required permission he no longer knew how to request. "Then tell me," he said, voice lowered, "what am I to you now?" Evelyn studied him for a long moment, and in that pause something irreversible settled within her. Not forgiveness, not revenge, but clarity. "You are no longer the place I stand," she said at last. "You are the moment I learned I could stand elsewhere." A silence followed that seemed to expand rather than end. The Duke's expression tightened, not in anger, but in the recognition of something slipping beyond retrieval. Before he could respond, a distant knock echoed through the corridor outside the room, sharper, urgent, breaking the fragile containment of their exchange. The Duke turned slightly toward the sound, instinctively drawn back into the world of titles and interruptions. But Evelyn remained where she was, watching him not as a wife, but as someone witnessing the final shape of a man she once believed unshakable. And as the knock came again, louder this time, accompanied by the unmistakable voice of a servant announcing an unexpected arrival bearing Lady Seraphina Vale's seal, Evelyn understood that whatever truth had begun to form between them was now on the edge of being interrupted before it could ever become confession. Evelyn did not move immediately. She remained between truth and interruption, as though any motion might collapse the fragile clarity she had just discovered within herself. The Duke stood rigid, aware that the arrival outside the door threatened to pull him back into roles he no longer understood. Outside, the servant's voice repeated Lady Seraphina Vale's name with careful urgency, as if the house itself had begun to shift. Evelyn finally turned her gaze toward the Duke, not with expectation, but with the quiet certainty of someone witnessing the last fracture of a bond she once believed unbreakable, while the footsteps outside drew closer, carrying the inevitable interruption of everything unspoken between them now. The corridor outside the drawing-room doors grew louder with each passing second, the disciplined rhythm of servants disrupted by an arrival that did not wait for permission. Evelyn Ashbourne remained still, yet every sense within her had sharpened to an unnatural clarity, as though silence itself had become a language she could now fully understand. The Duke of Ravenshollow had not spoken since the interruption, his attention split between the unfinished confession within the room and the presence forcing itself upon his household without invitation. The doors opened before formal announcement could complete itself. Lady Seraphina Vale entered as though she had always belonged to thresholds rather than rooms, her presence composed, luminous, and unsettlingly assured. Her gown, deep ivory touched with restrained silver embroidery, carried no excess, only intention. She paused briefly when she saw Evelyn, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement, like someone recognizing a position already studied and assessed. "Your Grace," Seraphina said softly, inclining her head toward the Duke, her tone carrying familiarity that required no proof. "I hope I have not arrived at an inopportune moment." The Duke did not respond immediately. The weight of the unfinished conversation still lingered between him and his wife, yet Seraphina's presence fractured it without effort, as though fragility had been waiting for pressure to collapse. Evelyn observed the exchange without movement. She had not been addressed, yet her silence remained intact, not from exclusion alone but from choice. For the first time she did not feel pushed aside. She felt as though she were watching the structure of her life being rearranged in real time. "You should not have come," the Duke said at last, his voice restrained though not cold. "I did not come for permission," Seraphina replied gently, though her eyes softened in a way that suggested certainty rather than apology. "I came because silence has grown too crowded to remain unanswered." A faint tension tightened in the Duke's expression. He turned slightly toward Evelyn as though searching for grounding, but found only stillness. She had not spoken since Seraphina entered, yet her presence now felt distant, like a portrait observed from another room. Seraphina stepped further inside, her gaze moving briefly between them. "I have been spoken of," she continued, "but rarely too. That distinction, I have learned, changes everything in the way a house breathes." Evelyn's voice finally broke the air, calm and precise. "Then you understand its rhythm well enough to disrupt it deliberately." Seraphina met her gaze directly for the first time. "Not disrupt," she said. "Reveal." The word lingered, unsettling in its simplicity. The Duke moved between them then, not as mediator, but as a man suddenly aware that every silence he had maintained was now occupying physical space. "This is not the place for such conversations," he said, though even he seemed uncertain what place remained untouched by them. Seraphina turned toward him, her expression softening further. "And yet it is the only place where truth has not yet been dressed for society." A pause followed, heavy and unbroken. Outside, rain struck the windows harder, as though responding to the shift within. Evelyn finally stepped away from the window entirely. Her movements were measured, not hurried, but final in their intent. "There is no truth left here," she said quietly. "Only sequence. And sequence is no longer something I intend to follow." The Duke's gaze snapped toward her. "Evelyn." She raised a hand gently, not to silence him, but to prevent continuation. "Do not," she said. "You have spoken enough in fragments to last a lifetime." Something in his expression tightened at that, not anger, but realization that he could no longer rearrange meaning through hesitation. Serafina watched this exchange without interruption, her composure unbroken. "She is right," she said finally. "Continuity without clarity becomes only repetition. And repetition becomes erasure." The Duke exhaled slowly as though the air itself had grown heavier. "What do you want from me?" he asked, not to Serafina alone, but to the space between them both. Evelyn answered first. "Nothing," she said. "That is what makes it complete." The simplicity of it struck harder than accusation. The Duke took a step forward, then stopped, realizing that every direction now led away from resolution rather than toward it. Evelyn moved toward the writing desk. For a moment, neither man nor visitor attempted to stop her. The act itself seemed already decided, only awaiting execution. She opened a drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope, untouched until now. Its wax bore no ornament, only finality. Serafina's voice softened. "You are not required to vanish to preserve dignity," she said. Evelyn looked up briefly. "I am not vanishing," she replied. "I am removing myself from interpretation." The Duke took a step closer again, this time without hesitation. "Is this what you believe I have done?" he asked, voice lower now, stripped of public composure. "Reduced you to something that must be interpreted away?" Evelyn met his gaze fully. "No," she said. "You reduced certainty until I no longer recognized where I stood within it." Silence followed, deeper than before, as though the house itself had withdrawn to listen. Then she placed the letter upon the desk, not offering it to him, not discarding it, but completing it. "I will not attend the winter assembly," she said, "nor any engagement where presence is expected but recognition uncertain." The Duke's expression tightened sharply. "You cannot simply withdraw from your position." "I already have," she replied. Serafina did not smile, nor did she interfere. Instead, she lowered her gaze slightly, as though acknowledging a shift that had finally crossed beyond personal dispute into structural consequence. Evelyn turned away from both of them then, walking toward the door without haste. Her departure was not dramatic. It was precise, like a decision made long before this moment had arrived. The Duke moved after her instinctively. "Evelyn, wait." She paused at the threshold but did not turn. "There is nothing remaining in waiting," she said softly. "Only repetition dressed as hope." And then she left. The door closed behind her with a sound that was not loud, yet carried further than any raised voice in the room. For a moment, neither the Duke nor Serafina spoke. The drawing room felt altered, not emptied, but recalibrated, as though something essential had been removed and the structure had not yet learned how to compensate. Finally, Serafina broke the silence. "She has chosen absence," she said quietly. The Duke did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the closed door, as though expecting it to reopen through correction of thought alone. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of certainty. "No," he said. "She has chosen ending without permission." Outside, footsteps faded down the corridor, and somewhere within the vast house, a door opened to night without announcement.